This is part 3 in a discussion about applied research and using research skills that we're going to be developing in this class in a practical way, this case in looking at program evaluation. So let's begin with what is program evaluation. It's a systematic process of collecting, analyzing, using data to examine the effectiveness and efficiency of programs with an eye toward continual program improvement, right? So we're collecting data, we're analyzing a program, and we're trying to figure out how we can make it better. That's program evaluation. This is used in public sector, government, nonprofit, but it's also used in private sector organizations. That phrase, continual program improvement, is sort of an important management concept that we're always looking for ways to make things better, that it's sort of an ongoing cycle of improvement and evaluation. When we're conducting program evaluation, it might be internally focused, like I want to know how to make my program better, but it could also be for a external audience, right? I might have a grant funding organization or the government that gave me money and wants to know, did I fulfill my grant and am I doing a good job? And so I'm conducting this program evaluation for them. Sometimes program evaluation is handled internally. There are also organizations that will conduct program evaluations for other organizations. And so you can get a job as a professional program evaluator going into different organizations to kind of conduct this kind of analysis. So putting program evaluation to our larger story of our logic models. So we have sort of our inputs, which could be our resources, our cash, our computers, our buildings, or our targets, the people or the situations we're trying to change. Those get fed into a process, right? Our theory of change or our program. And there's outputs, things that we can track and measure, and outcomes that hopefully feed in and affect that larger goal that we're trying to do. And out of those outputs and outcomes, we do sort of a feedback process that goes in and informs our inputs. And so, if we're trying to increase high school retention and we find that it works really, really well for women, but not for men, okay, that tells us something about our targets, about this program works well with this audience. Maybe we need to do something different for that audience over there. It can also affect, inputs. This program is working really well, it should scale up, or this program is not working well and probably should be discontinued. No more funding. Right? So that's what that idea of feedback is. And if you'll note, it's sort of a loop and it keeps going. That's the basic idea of continual program improvement. Okay, so some vocabulary again. Some of this we've seen a little bit before, but again, I think it's worth highlighting our inputs, our resources, the money, labor, facilities, all that goes into our process. Also, the individuals that we're seeking to affect go into that process. They also get treated as inputs. We've got our process or our program. It does something. It takes the resources and the targets and sort of makes them interact in some way. And out of that comes outputs, things that we can measure, things that we can track, and then outcomes, things that we've sort of logically linked to our goal. That might be a little bit abstract. It might be a little bit harder to measure, but we've sort of theoretically linked into all this, and then our feedback loop as well. So we've got all of those different parts of that logic models now sort of defined, and we talk about some of the more big picture philosophical decisions that folks who do program evaluation have to sort of make and have to wrestle with. And so one thing that makes program evaluation a little bit different than more traditional social science research is that we are interested in working with and navigating stakeholders. Stakeholders are people who have an interest in a program. Typically with academic research, nobody is interested in what I'm doing. I chose a topic because I'm interested in it. I'm working on the topic because I'm interested in it. And I'm not necessarily required to ask permission or work with anybody else on this or keep anybody else up to date. That's not how it works in the program evaluation world, where there's lots of folks who have an interest. There's funding organizations that have an interest. There's the population or the community that's being served by a program that has an interest. There's people who work for the program whose salaries depend on its being continued, who have an interest. There are all of these people who have an interest in how that evaluation plays out. And the feedback that we create, right, the process of program evaluation, it potentially affects those people, right? And potentially affects them in negative ways, which can trigger sort of a reaction of defense, right? That people may not want to share information with you. They may not want to work with you, and they may be in a position to control that entire program evaluation process in a way that can make it very difficult to do your job, right? So funding and approval may all depend on you working with and navigating those stakeholders and getting them to feel comfortable about that process to allow you to conduct the research that you have to conduct. But at the end of the day, you're working within sort of the limits imposed by those stakeholders, people who have a lot of power over that program and a power over that evaluation process. And it can be an exercise in negotiation in a way that I don't think is typically the case with more traditional social science research. It's also possible, and I should flag this, that sometimes stakeholders already know exactly what they want. This is not just sort of to say that they, of course, want to keep their job, sort of self-interested. But sometimes organizations are kind of running smoothly and people are happy with the status quo. And even if you identify ways to change things or make it better, that's not what people are interested in. They're not going to use that feedback in an effective way. They just want sort of the box checked. And that is a common enough situation that I think it's worth recognizing that we have these ideals of continual program improvement, but we also are sort of operating in the real world with people, and people can be really happy with what they're doing, not want to rock the boat or not seek change. So we do what we do. Okay, so a program evaluator may want to consider how they're going to think about what they're doing, and two different sort of philosophical approaches to evaluating programs are the Blackbox approach and the theory-driven approach. And there's sort of a qualitative, quantitative divide here, more of a descriptive research versus experimental research divide. I'll just kind of walk you through what the difference is, and you can see maybe some of the strengths and weaknesses. And over the course of the semester, when we sort of roll out the methods that undergird these, you can sort of see some of the deeper assumptions that go into it. So a black box evaluation says, I'm going to look at the program. You told me what the outcomes and the output should be. I'm just going to look at that. We've got our inputs. I know you spent some money. I know you did some stuff. Let's look at our outcomes and our outputs. And if we see outcomes and outputs improving, changing, getting better, I'm just going to assume that your program did that. That's the black box evaluation. I'm not really looking at whether or not you're using resources effectively. I'm not looking at whether or not you did what you said you were going to do. I'm not looking at anything related to that. I'm just looking at that sort of outcome to see, did we get change in the direction that we wanted? If the answer is yes, maybe that's a good sign. If the answer is no, I don't have a way to really figure out why that is. Is it because you didn't do the things that you said you were going to do, or you mismanaged things? Or is it because there's a broader phenomenon going on in the world, right? It's that recession that just basically made everything awful for a couple of years, and nobody was going to be able to show good results no matter how effective their program was. A black box evaluation doesn't really allow you to do that. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where you don't have good access and you don't have the ability to really conduct a more descriptive kind of study because you either didn't collect the data in a timely enough manner, or you weren't able to sort of navigate the stakeholder dynamic to be able to get information and get data and get observations from people, this might be a reasonable approach to take. The other approach is the more theory-driven evaluation, which is maybe even less interested in the outcomes and the outputs than it is, did you have a coherent logic model, right? A coherent story about how you're going to affect change, a story that people buy. And if they buy it, then my job as the evaluator is just to figure out, did you walk that logic model through, right? Did you do the things that you said you were going to do? Did you follow the plan? Were things executed? Did it play out, right? You said you were going to have 15 voter registration sessions. Did you have 15 voter registration sessions? Great. Show me how many people showed up to each of them. How many volunteers did you have? How many folks did you get registered at each of those? That's great. I don't have to know whether or not that increased long-term voter engagement and entrenched democratic norms, that's not important to me. You had a good story you were telling, and I can document throughout that process that you were doing the things that you were going to say you were going to do. And so I'm confident because of that, that this program is working because not because I know anything about the outcomes, but because I know that the process worked, or at least was what I was expecting to see. So those are, again, very different philosophical approaches to evaluation. And that difference that between the black box approach and the theory-driven approach is actually going to kind of undergird this entire course as we see different methods that will embrace or be more applicable to one approach versus another. Another sort of philosophical question that program evaluators need to wrestle with is, how are you going to think about this research task? And so I'll give you two sort of extremes, then I'll talk you through sort of what I think has become a consensus within the program evaluation world. So a researcher-driven evaluation is one in which you say, look, I've been trained in social science. I know what the heck I'm doing as a researcher, and everybody else just needs to get out of the way and allow me to conduct this evaluation the way that I think it should be done, right? I'm going to determine what to investigate and how we're going to do it, and I'm going to set the standards, and me, as the expert brought in to do this evaluation, I'm the one who's going to be central to this whole process. Right? That's one way you can go. And there's a logic to that, right? I mean, there is something about people having been trained in research methods and measurement and sampling who are less likely to sort of make bad mistakes that are potentially going to give you biased data. The other extreme, we could talk about stakeholder-driven evaluation, which the program evaluator essentially hands over to stakeholders the research design development. You tell me what you want me to do. You tell me what data should be collected and what data should be reported, and I'll go and do that. And as a result, I'm functioning almost as a proxy for stakeholders. And maybe that's actually a good thing, right? I mean, stakeholders have oftentimes incredible knowledge about a program, right? They know what kind of data is collected regularly, what would be easy to get. They have a sense about what's not easy to get, or what might be politically volatile. And so I think where we're moving is a recognition that researchers may end up functioning as a mediator between different stakeholders who have, I shouldn't say we're going, part of the stakeholder-driven evaluation is that the job of the evaluator is to help mediate those differences between stakeholders who might want different things, right? The grant making organization may want a very rigorous evaluation. The people who are, the targets of the program may want a less rigorous evaluation because they don't want to fill out 50 forms. Right? You could see people having conflicting interests, and the evaluator needs to kind of figure out how to make all that work together. Where I think we're going is something that kind of merges the two, but then takes it in a slightly different direction. And that's what's called empowerment evaluation. And this is a model of evaluation in which the evaluator isn't necessarily running things. The stakeholders aren't necessarily running things. There's a collaborative process in which you bring people who are involved in the program, stakeholders, into the process from the very start in terms of how they design it. And the idea is that if your participants, your staff, your targets are on board with the way that the evaluation is going to run, they're more likely to collect the data in a timely manner. They're more likely to get things done and reported in a way that's going to be useful if they buy into that whole evaluation process. They're also less likely to sabotage you to protect their job, right? If they have input in terms of how things are being measured or what's being collected or how things are being scrutinized, that power in that process is going to reduce some of the tension, reduce some of the anxiety, and people are more willing to work with you if they feel like they've been able to ensure that the process is going to be fair. It also can be less expensive, right? I mean, if I am hired as an external evaluator and I'm responsible for doing everything, you're gonna be paying me a consulting fee on that. If you're able to sort of make this part of what your organization does and get your various employees to kind of do this as part of their job because they're embracing this evaluation approach, that's potentially a more efficient way than me trying to track down documents, that I have no idea where they are, where they're collected, figuring out somebody else's filing system versus the people who are sort of, closely involved in working with this data on a day-to-day basis. And I think the real benefit of empowerment evaluation is that if you bring people into designing and carrying out program evaluation, they're more likely to be interested in the findings. They're more likely to say, wow, we're doing really good here. We've got a problem here. What can we do to fix that problem? And while it places a lot of power in the hands of people who are stakeholders with a vested interest in the process, it also can draw on that vested interest in the process and some of that energy that comes from that in a more positive way that's actually going to get an evaluation and feedback used in a way that will generate real effective change. And so I think this idea of empowerment evaluation is where the evaluation field is kind of at right now. And I think it's useful to sort of think about that versus the other two models of I'm the researcher and I know what's best and I'm going to tell you how to do it. And you're the stakeholders and you got to figure out how to work together so that you can tell me how to implement this evaluation. This is a different kind of model. This is a we're team working together and we're going to figure out a way to make this a fair and sustainable and useful evaluation that's actually going to be used for continual program improvement.